So, in the early 1980s, my family spent a lot of time traipsing through empty model homes in Mississauga. My parents had been in Canada for just under 10 years. They already had 3 kids, but somehow they had already made it to be in the market for the holy grail of North American real estate, the single family dwelling. They finally picked a model, and in 1985, we moved into our new home on Aldermead Road. Our new neighborhood was literally the next frontier of Mississauga's development. It was built up out of nothing, and there was a lot of it that wasn't even complete until years after we moved in. But by the time we got there, as far as I was concerned, the community had everything a kid could want. There was the hill, the field, the forest, the creek, the school, and the corner store. The hill and the field were the places where we spent a lot of time. The field was directly behind our backyard, and it ran parallel to all of the houses on our side of the street. It seemed like it went on for miles. It was vast and unkempt, and it was really kind of scary for me sometimes because the grass came up to my knees. I always felt like there were bugs and invisible creatures in there, and in the summertime, the weeds and stuff would scratch at my legs. But together, the hill and the field were the foundation for really good adventures. The hill was good for 2 things. 1, rolling down, and number 2, sledding. But there were always those times when you got that perfect snow, like the kind that was really compact and you would have a perfect sheet of ice on top. And those were the times when we would do our sledding in the field. We would climb all the way up the street. It seemed like we were going forever, but it was like 6 or 7 houses up. And then we would zoom past all the houses on either our blue plastic crazy carpets from Canadian Tire or our wooden toboggan, which if we were lucky, my dad would wax so that we would have no friction, and then we would just pray that we wouldn't crash into a tree at the other side. When we first moved in, our neighborhood didn't have any grass. So it was very exciting when the developer first started to lay sod. They started doing this by putting huge piles of soil into everybody's backyard. And when you're like the size of a 6-year-old, they look like massive pyramids of soil, and it was so fascinating. We would play hide and seek behind them, we would run and look for each other, and occasionally we tried to climb them. I remember once we took out umbrellas and we would hold them over our heads like this so that we could see each other from far away. Eventually one of the adults told us that this stuff was actually manure, and then it was like even more exciting because our playground was made out of poo. The other thing we didn't have when we first moved in was fences. So in between everybody's backyards, we were free to go wherever we pleased. What was really interesting looking back is that somehow, despite the ability to go wherever we wanted, we had a really clear understanding of the difference between public and private space. Our first encounter with our next door neighbor, her name was Sandra, was when she wandered into our backyard to play with a tree that had fallen down from the field. My older sister, she was 2 years older than me, she immediately recognized that this 6-year-old kid was a trespasser. And she stood at our back door, she waited until she made eye contact with Sandra, and then slowly and wordlessly, she pointed her away. Over the years, as we had, quarrels and things like that you have as kids, nothing would put a more powerful conclusion to an argument than when one kid would declare to another, "Get off my property!" So there were all these kinds of exciting things that happened in the neighborhood, but there were also really peaceful and magical moments that I remember when I look back. One of them is that in the beginning, we would very frequently see deer in our backyard. Sometimes we'd be sitting in the kitchen or somewhere else in the house, and my mom would call us over, because if you stood at the glass doors, you could see out into the field, and a couple of deer would wander by. We would stand there in complete silence and stare at them, and they would stay for a few minutes and stare back. When we got older, the landscape of the neighborhood continued to serve our needs. We had a ritual that we did in the summertime when I was in high school. It's called jailbreak, and you might think that it's just like a different name for hide and seek, except you had teams. But at the time, it felt like it was really cool and edgy because we used to play only in the nighttime, and we would only go out once it got dark. And there were some older boys from up the street who would come and join us, which made me feel really cool to be part of that game. I was really good at jailbreak. I had a favorite hiding spot. I would wear black, and then I would climb into Angela and Matthew's garden and pretend I was a rock. And I did this millions of times, and nobody ever found me. Looking back, I'm like, well, maybe they weren't looking. But anyway, that was my childhood. It was really happy. It was full of simple and innocent adventures, and they were very much a product of the landscape where we grew up. Fast forward to a few years when I became an eager urban planning student at U of T. By this point, I had moved downtown and I was ready to embrace my life in the 416. I was like, I'm not going to listen to Celine Dion anymore, and I'm not going to go to chain restaurants. I'm going to learn about sustainable development and listen to the CBC and learn about indie rock. The other thing was, by this point, I had learned this new language called planner speak, and I would use it all the time because it made me feel more legitimate. I would be like, TODs and TIFs and TEAGs and OMB and Section 37. And I believed that density was good and transit was great and gentrification was really, really bad. I remember, whenever I wrote papers, I was very concerned about the displacement of the artists once gentrification pushed them out. Like, in hindsight, I had no idea who the artists were or where they even lived. Anyway, one of the things that was interesting when I look back is that it was totally lost on me that there was a complete contradiction between my newfound faith in urbanism and the neighborhood where I had grown up. And I actually cringe when I think back to the fact that while I was in planning school, I used to brag to people about the fact that in Mississauga we hadn't had tax increases for years. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with that, but it was totally lost on me what the context of that situation was and actually the big problem that was emerging as a result. Eventually, the truth sort of became clear. I remember one day I was looking in a textbook or something, and it had those photographs of the quintessential suburban development that you see in North America. It was like those curvilinear streets, relentless cookie cutter houses with everything looking just the same. And this was basically a bad example of urban sprawl, and I stared at it for a while and was like, oh, that looks like home. So at that point, I had a little bit of a crisis of conscience because I realized that everything I associated with my cherished childhood and the place that I called home was actually the hallmark of urban sprawl. So our huge backyards, they were great, but that's because the density was really low. We didn't have any transit. You would have to walk 5 or 10 minutes just to get to the bus. And the field was actually a hydro corridor, and behind it there was a 400 series highway. The most fascinating thing was that I realized the neighborhood where we grew up, we had always called it Green Park. And at this point, I realized that wasn't the name of it at all. Like, everyone who lived there used to call it that. It was actually the name of the developer who had built our community, and because they had branded everything, we thought that's where we lived. So I was lamenting, and I would curse the planners of the years that came by and thinking, how could they have done such a horrible thing? When I was doing my fact-checking for this story, I made a really astonishing discovery, which some of you might not think is interesting, but if you're a planner, it's really cool. I basically found the original master plan for the neighborhood where I grew up. And I opened it up thinking oh, let's see what a piece of crap this is. And what was fascinating is that I realized that there were so many parallels between that document and all of the best master planning initiatives that we do today. It turns out that in the 50s and 60s, the developers who had built Don Mills in Toronto considered that to be a great success, and they were going to follow up with a similar initiative in Mississauga. So in 1969, they published this document for this place called Erin Mills Newtown. It was supposed to cover 8,000 acres, which is huge, but the intent was that this place was going to be built out over 20 or 30 years, which is essentially what has happened. When I was looking through it, for those of you especially who are planners, you'll realize how interesting it was to see that they covered everything that when we do a good planning exercise today, we intend to address. They started by analyzing the surroundings. They talked about the natural landscape, the connections to the surrounding city. It was an idea that it would be a mixed-use community. They would have a range of housing types and tenures for all people at all places in their life. There was going to be a strong community center. It would have recreation, amenity facilities, and places for people to work. They even did those drawings of the 5-minute walking radius from all of the local neighborhood centers to demonstrate that no matter where people lived, they would have reasonable amenities and things to get to within their immediate communities. one of the other things that was really cool is like in sort of like an eerie foreshadowing of the internet and the intelligent communities movement that we have today, was there was this whole chapter about this proposal for all of the houses to be networked by cable below the streets so that they'd get educational television programming delivered to every house. And that was supposed to be programmed by Mississauga's University of Toronto satellite campus, as well as a hospital that was located in the area. The most sobering thing for me about looking at that plan was the realization that just like many of the most interesting and ambitious master planning initiatives that we have today downtown, some of which I'm involved in and very proud of, a lot of the suburbs grew out of the best of urban planning thinking at the time. They obviously made some mistakes, but it's very likely that we're going to do the same. The other realization that I've come to is that the suburbs are not a trick that developers pulled, and they're also not a result of people making unenlightened choices about all the benefits of city living. People choose, what they don't choose is to live unsustainably. They don't choose excessive consumption of resources or cookie cutter houses. They really choose a place where they know that their kids are going to be able to play outside and where they can safely walk to school. If they're like my parents, they're immigrants who come from places where they could never have the types of things that our suburbs offer today. And trust me, if you come from a country like my parents with 1 billion people, then urban sprawl is paradise. In seriousness though, one of the most important things I've learned as a planner is that people's decision about where they're going to live is an incredibly personal thing. And as planners, we so often do all of our analysis and technical studies and use all our jargon, and I think we need to do a little bit of a better job of setting that aside sometimes and understanding the very personal and non-technical decisions that people make about where they want to live. There really isn't a conclusion to my story except to say that my experience growing up in the suburbs has really shaped the way that I look at things as a planner and broadened the perspective that I take. And the best that I can hope is that in 20 or 30 years, when somebody looks back at the work that I do, hopefully it reflects that thoughtfulness. Thanks.